if you told people that Iranians are protesting because of fuel prices or because of economic issues, a lot of people in the West also relate to that, right? They seem like, okay, we also had this
Oh, that's
problem.
true.
This is
Yeah.
also something that we have experienced. But when you say that people like in Iran are protesting because they are forced to wear a headscarf, then this is something that nobody in the West wants to. It feels so. They feel so outraged. Oh, men are telling women what to wear.
Well, welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales. Uh, this is a sort of special episode. We're going to talk about the recent events in Iran and uh, and sort of get a deeper understanding of what's going on that the mainstream media is actively preventing most people from, or is not sharing that with the world. So uh, maybe you could, Sarah, you could tell us like what your feelings are being in Iran, uh, of what's been going on and how the outside world has um, has been representing it.
Well, as everyone already knows, the protests started with the tragic death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. She was 22 years old, and apparently she was detained by the morality police. By the way, the Farsi word for it is Gasht Ershad, which translates into guidance patrol. But in English, most people know it as morality police. And then she died in police custody, and the police released CCTV footage where she actually was talking to one police woman, and a few seconds afterwards, she fell. She went into coma, and a couple of days or 3 days after, she died in the hospital. There were so many questions around what happened and what actually happened, because um, there were people who said that she had been beaten to death, but the footage does not show that. And also, this CT scans of her brain do not show any trauma. But there were also people who said that she had bruises on her legs, which shows that she went through more than what we see in that footage. But because the question, I remember that well before this happens, there was an online campaign against the morality police, and I was one of the people who took part uh, in that campaign and used the Persian hashtags to talk about it. The discussion has been there for a few years now, but the protest, I mean, the death of Mahsa Amini made people really angry, and they took to the streets to make a statement to the state and also demand investigation into the case. But because Mahsa came from a Kurdish region, there were people who used that to say that there's oppression against the Kurds and that this is an ethnic issue, which Mahsa's family denied. In an interview, her uncle and her dad said that this has nothing to do with their ethnicity. It's an issue about all of Iran and Iranian women. So I'm not going to, I mean, obviously there were riots, there were protests, and peaceful protests started getting very violent. Many people have died, including police officers. And I'm not going to talk about the police brutality, not because it doesn't exist, but because I think we have seen enough and heard enough about it. And if people want to know about it, they can just search online, and there are real and fake images that show police brutality in Iran. Um, so I think the main thing that I personally observed was that, because I live in Isfahan, which is the third largest city in Iran. It's known as traditional and conservative city, even though we have a Christian community and a Jewish community here. Um, but it's usually known as more traditional and conservative. And by that I mean you can see a large proportion of the population observes the hijab perfectly, and that you can get people telling you to correct your hijab if you're not like observing it properly, because that's something that they believe and they feel responsible to tell you that you should observe it. But we also have had civil disobedience against, for example, banning riding bicycles for women. It was never a law, but some, like the Friday prayer, the Imam of the Friday prayer of Isfahan, the leader, said that this is a religious city, and Isfahan is known for having a lot of martyrs and war veterans during the Saddam invasion of Iran, which was backed by the US and many other powers. So they see it as they see any form of um, I don't know, like mm, anything that is against their conservative religious belief as a disrespect to the values that they strongly believe in. So there were talks about how this should not happen. We're not going to allow that. But a lot of women, including very like religious women who observed hijab completely, started riding bicycles all across the city without using hashtags, without even organizing anything. Like, it did not happen as an organized campaign against it. It just naturally and organically happened that women did not want to accept it, and they wanted to show how they will do what they believe in. And now seeing women and girls riding bicycles in Isfahan is a very common scene. Like, it's very common to see girls riding bicycles everywhere, and nobody is talking about it anymore. And I think that that's because this is the way that this is the form of protest that works here, not hashtags revolutions. Because, you know, Twitter is blocked in Iran. Not many people in Iran have access to Twitter. And I think in probably most of the countries in the world, the social media is not a reflection, an exact reflection of what happens in the society. But for Iran, it's especially not, because, as I said, for example, Instagram has a lot of Iranian users, but that's not the case for Twitter. And one reason is because it was blocked. It started back in 2009, I think they blocked it, and it has always been blocked. So it's not very easy for people to access it, unlike Instagram, which just recently got blocked after these protests emerged. So yes, I think the main issue for me was that when I started looking into Instagram or Twitter, like when I just opened Instagram and Twitter, I would feel that like everyone is in my city, or at least a really great and significant number of people in my city and in my country are protesting what has happened to not just Mahsa Amini, but the morality police and everything around it. But when I just go downtown or walk in my neighborhood or visit my friends and family, it's like a totally different Iran. And because this year we didn't have a really, I mean, the protest here happened, of course, and there were crackdowns on them. But it wasn't very significant, especially in Isfahan. I know that in Tehran, it was very different. In Rash, for example, it was very different. Some cities in the Western Iran as well. And some of those cities very much smaller, but they see a great population turning in. But in Isfahan, this was not the case. And you can see a lot of people from Isfahan. I actually saw one description of the events in Isfahan here by someone who apparently took part in. I mean, I saw it online, so I can't tell, but by someone who apparently took part in the protest and was totally against not only the morality police but the establishment, and they were complaining how people in Esfahan have been holding, for example, the religious people have been holding their morning ceremonies, and like a few meters apart from them you can see people having ice cream, walking down the street, shopping, and families having picnic like nothing is happening. And then a few meters away from them you can see a few people chanting slogans, and the riot police is standing there, and they were complaining that this is paradoxical and like why don't people take part into that and things. But I think it's actually beautiful how life goes on, the protests happen, um, but like everyone is peacefully practicing what they believe in. Because I think like I have talked to my friends who do not even observe the hijab, I mean, in their private gatherings, and they don't believe in it, and they're all tell me that this is not their number one like priority. There are many other issues, especially cultural issues, that they wish to address, especially through education, and it's a long term process. It doesn't happen overnight, and we have changed a lot of things. We have over these 4 decades, we have changed a lot of things, and that has always happened with Iranian women educating their children and their families, and launching campaigns, um, electing different parliament members who would kind of reflect their ideas and then what they demand. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I just could comment on a few things. I think one is like some statistics from the US. I think it's about 5 people die every day in America in police custody. And if you just Google death in police custody, you'll find the most horrific stories. I mean, many times in Texas, and I think it's Rikers Island in New York City that's known for this. They don't provide air conditioning, and so people literally like bake to death in their cells in the summer. And then in a number of places, there's a recent case that actually was settled in court for millions of dollars, where North Carolina failed to give water to an inmate, and he died of dehydration. And he was mentally challenged as well. So these are mentally ill people. These are vulnerable, unwell people that the state is killing in custody by depriving them of basic needs, which is, it's a human rights violation that would go against all international agreements on how you should treat prisoners, even in wartime. And these people are dying in American custody. There's one case of a man being set on fire who was also obviously mentally disturbed because it's on video. So, like, these are horrific cases of deaths, which nobody gets out on the street for in America. So that shows that this is a kind of manipulated outrage in one case. And the other is, what else was I going to say? There was deaths in police. There was one other thing he said that it was like triggered me, because well, I can't remember. Anyway, but the other thing I wanted to say is the term hashtag revolution, I think originally started out as color revolution, and that actually came about before hashtags existed, and it was the idea of like associating a color or some other kind of easily communicatable marketing device with a revolution, so that it would be promoted sort of outside of the ideal of the revolution. It could be create sort of a hysteria around something, and then that can distract from the actual goal, the actual original fundamental value that the revolution was meant for, which is something usually people agree about, some sort of human rights issue or something like that. And it gets extrapolated from there into what the father of color revolutions, Gene Sharp, his goal was to use that desire for societal change to create regime change. And that's like the initial stages, is to find something that people think is a good thing that people need to unite against to change society, and then morph that into a way of destroying the target country. So that's the real problem with this situation, is that, of course, the Western liberal and even conservatives abroad would say, yeah, we don't want to cover ourselves. I mean, there's a problem with that as well, because it's very culturally centric. People often don't realize how culture is different in other countries, and that because it doesn't feel right for you or your family in your culture, it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel right for other cultures. And so to just sort of impose what feels good to you or feels right to you on others is not that's not a not rational it's not rational, first of all, and it's also not very human, because you're trying to create less diversity of the human experience on Earth. And it's the main problem with colonialism and the other things that people criticize that have been done by the West around the world. It's all because there's this idea that the West is right, and the global South somehow is the student of the West to learn how to be a good human. And it's really kind of perverse. So that's where I would like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, that's exactly how it feels, because you mentioned that this is like very culturally centered. Even in Iran, if you like travel throughout Iran, the way people observe hijab, even in cities where there is no morality police, because you know that morality police exists only in some major cities. It's not that we have it everywhere. And even in every city, it's like in Esfahan, there are certain regions that the morality police uh, usually can appear. It's not that they are everywhere and people are always getting arrested. And you can go to places in Esfahan or in Tehran and other cities where there is no morality police. And women have their scarves around their neck, and it's not covering. And the way they dress is very different, and there's no morality police to stop them. So that's one idea. And as I said, like when you go to different cities, people observe hijab very differently. And for example, someone coming from a very religious family or city, going to a city where the hijab standards or modesty standards are very different, may even get shocked on how people are observing it. And even religiously, this is you can set a very strict standard for it, because the culture also plays a role, and it can be very different in different parts of in different parts of Iran. So now this is also true about notions of modesty or women's liberty and freedom in different parts of the world. I mean, not everyone has the same understanding of what respecting modesty, for example, means. And in Iran, there are many surveys, but I'm not going to say the statistics, because it's very difficult to know if the state runs the survey or if it comes from outside. It's very important to know if those statistics are very correct. But what you can feel when you live in Iran in different cities is that there is still a really significant proportion of the population that would practice hijab even if it was not mandatory. And there is also a proportion of the population who would not want to see that, for example, the mandatory hijab is lifted. They're not the majority by now. They used to be, but they're not the majority by now, according to those surveys. But they're still significant. And I personally, I have friends from other countries, or I read online about how they describe Iranian women's fight for freedom, or including for freedom to choose what they want to wear. And what I feel is that sometimes it feels like they're talking from a position of self righteousness, They feel that their standards have to be observed by anyone around the world. They feel that, like they know that, and they should tell Iranian women how to fight for their freedom, how to uh, fight for their rights. And this is really not respectful. And we also have Iranian expats um, who take part into that, and that's even more sad because they come from this culture. Many of them have not even lived here, or maybe have left Iran many, many years ago, and things are very different. They have families from certain, groups of or certain with certain ideas that exist here and are very respectable, but they're not the majority, and they do not represent everyone here. And what is like what I see missing in like reporting about what's going on in Iran is that there are almost no voices that like genuine voices that we hear from inside Iran. It's mostly, especially, I mean, the government's crackdown on the internet made that even more difficult. And there are not many people who speak English, and those reporting are usually in English. So we just see Iranian expat women, for example, representing Iran and saying that they the voices of Iranian women, but they usually have very different ideas from what the majority of Iranian women here think. And it doesn't seem that this really matters to mainstream media. And as I said, like if you go to you just check social media, they are the only people who are considered as Iranian or Iran experts and talking about it. I mean, it's good to have those voices, but their voices shouldn't be amplified over the voices that come from inside Iran.
Yeah, well, I could comment on some of those things. One, I think it's important to know that sometimes states make something illegal so that they don't have to actively enforce a law, but if something is so that they can control the extremity of it. So they could say if someone was actually violating something in extreme violation of the law, then they can say, but it's actually illegal. So there's a lot of laws in America that are there and they're completely unenforced, but they could be enforced. And so it's a way of, because if you didn't have a law in place and you have a majority society that wishes to live in a religious way, it's very hard to come to someone and say, and they're like, well, it's not against the law. So it's like, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I'm saying I could understand how, if you have a majority of people in a population who want to live in a modest way, having people who flagrantly disrespect that can seem extremely offensive. And I would say for a Western audience, you could try and picture if it was, if like, nudity was allowed, and you'd walk down the street and there'd just be random naked people walking around the street, and they could say, well, it's my right, it's my body. I mean, there's a whole naturalist community that argues that this is what they should be able to do, and that it's just distracting, and it's not, and that's what it feels like. I've lived in the Muslim world, and I've lived there long enough. They've come to understand that that definitely is what it feels like when you live in a society that's modestly dressed, and then you move to a society that isn't modestly dressed. It's 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 surprising how your perspective of people changes, and you expect that, and you're like, wow, this is very different than what I was living in. And it's I totally empathize with that problem. So I just think that people should try and be more sensitive to how difficult it is to organize big groups of people who have differing ideas. And I think in Iran it tends to be, people have generally united around this idea of modesty, and the West should respect it. And I would say, you were talking about regulating modesty. Well, I mean, some cultures don't modesty for women. Some cultures don't even know how to define what a woman is, and that's a fundamental problem growing
Exactly.
in the West. And I
Yeah,
think that
exactly.
it's a little interesting to hear a culture like that try and lecture another culture about how women should be when they can't even really they can't put a tack in what a woman is right now. So, but so the attacks on women's rights are also in the West, because you can't define what a woman is, you can't protect them.
Exactly.
And then I was going to say earlier, I'd forgotten what I was going to say, is you talked about police brutality. And I would say in America is a master at police brutality. It happens all the time. And like a good example of a horrific brutality was carried was carried out by the Obama administration against the Keystone XL pipeline protesters, which was an indigenous protest, a protest of indigenous people, a peaceful protest. It was a simple encampment of teepees where people were living on the land and peacefully blocking the expansion of this pipeline, which since then has leaked and caused major environmental catastrophes. So they were right to have wanted to block it, but the Obama administration cracked down on them. It was middle of the winter. It was freezing. They were spraying these people with water. They were causing hypothermia. One young man had his hand blown off by a grenade, one of these police grenades, and lost his hand. So it was extremely violent, extremely dangerous for the lives of these people. And all they were doing was encamping on indigenous land to prevent the expansion of a pipeline. So, that's just one example. You can go through all the zillions of police deaths and murders of black people, and I mean it's insane that this is what's inspiring protest these days. In my opinion, it's the pot calling the kettle black is the English expression, and it's
Exactly.
very absurd. Or
We have the same thing in Farsi.
Okay. Right, and there's also the biblical phrase about the speck in your neighbor's eye. Like, why are you pointing out the speck in your neighbor's eye when there's a log jammed into yours? Like, it's absurd. So, some people use the phrase "whataboutism" to describe that, which is the complete opposite. It's like, it's why are you attacking this when there's that? I mean, they say that's what that is, but it's actually it's actually the idea of you should fix your own problems before you're going to point out the problems of others, and that is very different than having two different people violating a law that you yourself are adhering to, and then saying, "Oh, that's whataboutism." When you yourself are pure, and then you can point to one and excuse the other. Oh, what about the other? You that's whataboutism. But when you yourself are the more guilty party, there's no whataboutism involved. It's not that. It's
Exactly.
a lack of introspection and really a distraction. It's called projection propaganda is the technical term for that, where you're projecting the wrongs onto other people that you yourself are doing. It's a very typical Israeli tactic of calling the Palestinians terrorists when they're actually the terrorists.
And they're
so
resistant groups. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess you were talking about the Iranian people who live abroad. I mean, a lot of people left. I think many people may not understand that because there was a U.S. imposed dictatorship in Iran, there was a lot of corruption, and there were a lot of people who made a lot of money then, and there was a kind of an elite corrupt business class in Iran that was then kicked out or left during the revolution. And that elite business class was very non-religious, very secular, and basically just kind of divvying up the oil wealth of Iran and under the corruption of the West. And when that ceased, because the people took back control of their country, that population moved outside of Iran, and they've created this sort of anti-Iranian government movement or cultural cohesive group outside. And it's really similar to what happens in other situations like Cuba and Venezuela, where the people who leave sort of create this aesthetic of hatred against the regime or government that's there now. and that is really exploited by the U.S. So and Europe. So they even foster those groups, and they provide visas, and they provide the opportunity to settle in the U.S. for people who have those values, because then in this sort of situation they become very valuable, because that's who the people can be like, oh, my friend's Iranian and they hate the whatever, because you create the people who live here who are the ones. And so I would say that if you're not actually living in that country, in that culture right now, your opinion is secondary. It doesn't really matter. The important people are the people who live there, and this is their land and their environment that they live in. They have the right to determine what that is, not someone who has immigrated. And that's often used by colonial powers or imperialist powers, like you could see during the quote unquote elections in Syria that happened a while back, where they were like, oh, all the ex-Syrian people living abroad can also vote. And I thought that was an absurd misuse of that. And all the embassies opened up their doors to let these Syrians who live abroad vote. And it's just a way of increase. I mean, it's voting politics. They do it in domestic politics here too. They create these districts that are where they can inject all the right people to vote. And so they just feel, oh, there's these people out living outside. We can get their opinion too, because they're also quote unquote Iranian, but they don't live in Iran. So why? I mean, no, I think they should not be looked at primarily. I mean, their opinion matters, but it doesn't matter as much as the people who live there. So that's what I would say.
And in the case of Iran, it's still probably different from Syria, because Syria witnessed like a sort of I mean, it was under war, and a lot of people had to leave the country for their lives. It's so that's I mean, that's something that is probably more important, but it didn't happen for Iran. And a lot of people who were outside Iran and took part in elections, I mean, they usually still have some understanding of Iran, and that's because I would say that's because those who are like totally anti-Iranian government would never even take part into elections. So that's also something that is like, I would say, slightly different from Syria. But yes, that's the case. I mean, I have a lot of friends from different countries, because I have traveled to different countries for conferences, or people visited Iran for conferences and I was there. And what makes me really, I mean, it's really strange how the propaganda against Iran works, is that I got almost no one asking me what is happening, but instead getting their ideas of what is happening in Iran from mainstream media or social media like Twitter and elsewhere. And when I told them about what happened, some of them did not want to accept, or they were sometimes even like, you know, as if I wasn't telling the truth. And the thing is, well, I'm not saying that I represent everyone who lives here. I'm just one voice, but at least I live here, and I have always lived here. I mean, I've lived here for all of my life. I've never, I mean, been an expat or whatever. So at least you can like hear a voice from somewhere else. And what is also very unfair is that because this propaganda is very, very strong, if I talk, for example, online or to some of these friends that I have or people that I know, it's very, I mean, I could easily be labeled as someone who works for the regime or the government, because it's so difficult for them to believe that there are people in Iran who have a very different opinion from what you are hearing 24/7 online or on mainstream media. They can't believe it, and it's very difficult to fight that propaganda war against Iran, because people don't seem to really care. I mean, some of the people don't seem to really care about what is the truth. They want to hear what is the most probably comfortable narrative to go with. I mean, the one that you can't easily challenge, like something that you hear 24/7. is probably easier to believe in than something that you just randomly might hear if you ask people. So the propaganda war against Iran is really strong. I mean, we saw people like, for example, Roger Waters, who I personally had a lot of respect for, and he was very outspoken on, for example, Julian Assange or on Palestine. Um, Also falling for this propaganda. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, and it's really massive. And we also talked about hashtag revolution. Um, we have examples from previous years and previous uprisings that we had in Iran, that there are a lot of
But not Putin. It's
trolls and
not
fake
Putin's
accounts
war. Not Putin's war.
taking part and trying to. I didn't hear you for
I
a few
said, but not
seconds.
Putin's war. That
You said
wasn't a
not putting
hashtag.
what?
Not Putin's war. That definitely wasn't a hashtag
No,
revolution. That's a genuine
no, it wasn't.
invasion of a country.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Sorry,
exactly.
go ahead. I just
But the thing is, no, it's good to know, like, because it's not only Iran, but because I come from Iran, I feel very strong about it. But it's also because the hashtags in Farsi and English about the case of Mahsa Amini and the protest in Iran just broke a historical record on Twitter, which is amazing. Like, as if we haven't had any important, like any more significant issue happening in the world over the past decade. You see millions of hashtags in Farsi, and uh, like I think it already passed 120 million. I'm sure it passed it, because that's the number that I have from a few days ago.
But how
And
could
I
that
mean, and
be?
it's
How are you challenging that Twitter isn't the most like unhackable and manipulatable platform ever existed? I mean, it must be a genuine
if you allow me.
genuine survey of
Oh,
human
oh my God.
emotion, isn't it? Isn't Twitter like directly like a direct, perfect amalgamation of human thought? Like, it's obviously fake.
No,
It's so
absolutely.
fake. It's just crazy how fake it is.
Yeah, exactly. One case of this, because it wasn't, it's like it's happening on different levels. We have trolls and fake accounts, and including the ones that come from Albania, where the MEK has a camp with a few thousands of members, and they're employed to um, like hijack the hashtags or start a hashtag.
I guess we should say
And
what the MEK is if people don't know what that is.
Yeah,
MEK is a terrorist organization, but it is often known as an opposition group. They used to be on U.S. list of terrorist organizations and also EU's list of terrorist organizations until a few years ago. But because the funding of these groups against Iran would become a little bit difficult, they decided that to delist them, and they have been um, funded and trained by the U.S. and by Mossad to uh, carry out terrorist attacks and assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. There's one case, even before they were delisted, back during George Bush presidency, uh, MEK members were trained together with Mossad in Nevada to carry out assassinations to assassinate Iranian nuclear
Yeah,
scientists.
it's even
And even
more.
before that,
Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah,
I just want to say, even during that time, they were accused of killing something like 12 Americans. So they killed
yeah,
Americans,
exactly.
and the U.S. brought them to America to train them with the Israeli intelligence. So America is absolutely not a friend of its own citizens. But anyway, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, and they have also assassinated more than 17,000 Iranians. And they're just a really horrible cults.
Yeah, I mean, they have a weird
terrorist
thing.
organization.
There's
But
a
anyways, I
great
mean, they have been
wait.
involved.
We have to recommend this documentary that was it Press TV did it, or Press TV broadcast it, but it was made by someone else, because obviously no mainstream media would ever broadcast anything like this because it goes directly against imperialist narratives. But there's this great, I think if you go to Press TV's website and you just type in like MEK, or just type in MEK documentary Press TV in Google, it's just unbelievable. They have this like giant mansion in France. They have their leader died a long time ago, but the wife of the leader never like admitted that he died. And so there's all these kind of like brainwashed stormtroopers who think they're still worshiping this dead leader guy, but it's actually just his wife kind of like puppeteering the thing behind. And the guys are all celibate, so it's kind of like a weird monk army. These people, they're not allowed to like have wives or even engage in sexual activity. So it is absolutely 100% cult. Like there's no other way to describe it. It's not hyperbole to call it a cult. It's literally a cult. It's bonkers when you read it. You're like, how would anyone get involved in this? But there's a lot of young men, I guess, that are looking for purpose, and that gives it to them.
Yeah. Yeah, and if there is one thing that all Iranians from across the political spectrum, or religion, or expats, or anti-Iran, or like just whoever you can mention from Iranians, that they agree on, is that they all abhor MEK because of the records of assassinations and terrorist attacks that they have carried out inside Iran and outside Iran. So like every Iranian would hate them, and it's just the members and those who probably are paid by them who would work with them. So it's very important to understand them, because now they are passing by different names, and in like in claiming that they are working for the liberation of Iran. And it's interesting how the leader has met with different U.S. politicians, and they have, paid for different U.S. politicians. But yeah, and so what we were talking about, I guess, was that there are these different groups that are funded by maybe like, I mean, I would say there are these different terrorist groups also involved in like sabotage and hijacking the protests. So one thing that I think everyone should also bear in mind is that we have different separatist and terrorist groups at the borders. With, for example, the border with Pakistan and border with Iraq, like we have Kurdish separatist terrorist groups, we have Salafi terrorist groups, and we have also the MEK, which is also a terrorist group, and they are always, just ready to hijack any protest and to start making these protests very violent. Recently, the Iranian state said that they have arrested many of them just during these protests. So that's another reason that a lot of people in Iran, although they're very angry, grievances with different issues, like in any other dynamic society, they would want to avoid these protests because they have seen, for example, in 2009 or in 2019 also, how they infiltrated the protests and tried to make them very violent. I don't remember what we were talking about.
We were talking about Twitter and how Twitter has got troll farms in Albania. That's how we got off on MEK, okay. But that's all good stuff too. So I could just add in there. I mean, I think before this, obviously, people know that Twitter is just full of fake accounts. I mean, that's the whole point. Elon Musk didn't want to buy it because he realized it was mostly fake. And there was a new release by, I forget, the National Interest had an article about it. It's like the Pentagon had created all this AI system to create fake bots that just sort of like, they would just tell it like a theme that it should be doing, like and it figured it out. It would like create profiles with like AI generated photos and bios, and they look real. They look really genuine. And then they would engage on a topic. in order to shift opinions in one way or another. And they've been doing this for a long time abroad. And I think the gist of this article is that now they've started doing it in the U.S. domestically. But at any rate, because of Iran is one of the most hot political things going in terms of the imperialist agenda, I think that we can assume that a huge portion of the internet chatter on Iran is fake, and or at least paid troll farms, which is something Israel, which is, I would say, Israel's more anti-Iran than the U.S. has been doing for at least a decade, again, to shape global opinion on the Palestinian issue, on their theft of the Palestinian land. I would say I've engaged with the trolls on that issue, and yeah, they're just people who are just paid to do complete propaganda, and they just push it out over and over again. So it would be not surprising at all to me if a lot of the hysteria that's been generated around this is artificially created. Say that maybe bots, maybe like paid people, maybe Israeli draftees in some office in Tel Aviv. Who knows? But it almost.
But Twitter is also a part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, Twitter. I mean, it's allowing it. So why don't we go through this, because this exemplifies how Twitter is culpable of bad things. So can you talk about your interview on TRT, like what you said, what the reactions were, like how the host treated you, and then the resulting coverage of your interview. What happened there?
Yeah, so last Friday, not yesterday, the Friday before that, I was on Twitter with two Iranian expats. Sorry, I was on TRT with two Iranian expats, and I was interviewed as usual. It wasn't my first time on TRT or on.
TRT is a Turkish broadcaster that is very imperialist. They're allied with the West.
Yes. Yeah. And I know that, but we have very few like tools out there to speak.
Oh, sure, you should speak to everyone.
I try to be a voice from Iran, so I don't have many options. But anyway, so I was on this interview with two Iranian expats who are experts on Iran, and the presenter also. People can go and see for themselves what happened during that interview and what I said. But basically, I was criticizing the morality police. I was saying that I was against it, that I also think these protests are absolutely legitimate, although many people want to hijack it. I mean, there are people who want to hijack it or make it violent. But I also mentioned that in my city, based on my own observation and the observation of my family members, a couple of them even have taken part in the protest. The protests are much smaller than what happened, for example, in 2019, which it was more of the working class, and it was an economic issue that a lot of people related to it and wanted to take to the streets, and that was really big. So I also mentioned that what my family and friends tell me, because I usually do this, that before the interviews, I talk to my friends with different ideas, and I call my friends who work downtown, and I talk to family members who usually like pass through those areas, and I ask them. And I also mention that this is based on what I hear from my family members, that the gatherings, like there are different gatherings in different parts of the city, but usually up to that day, they're not more than maybe 100 people at one time. And the Persian account of the Independent, like edited and cut my speech, just did this snippet where I was talking about the number of people taking part in protests in Isfahan, saying that I'm pro-Islamic, instead of saying, for example, that I am also an Iranian citizen. They wanted to portray me as this pro-Islamic Republic, which I am proudly. But it doesn't mean that I can't like talk about the realities on the ground here. Uh, and saying, like, for example, that this political analyst is lying and this is not true, and they added it's very interesting how they added a video after my that snippet to show that the protests in Isfahan are much bigger. But two interesting things is that the video that they showed, according to them, was after my interview. They had the date in the Persian calendar wrong, and even the video does not show more than what I said. And it's interesting that a lot of people who took part in those protests and were totally against the Islamic Republic commented, like under the same post and on Twitter as well, that this is true. And they were complaining, like, why aren't more people taking part in this protest and everything? But someone who knew me, and I'm sure they did not watch the video at all, the interview at all. They just stick to that very short snippet that they watched. And because the like the Instagram account of Independent Pharmacy had not tagged me, I didn't even know that they had posted this. So someone who knew me tagged me under that post on Instagram, and she tagged a lot of people saying that this is my account and like teach her a lesson, or yeah, like attack her or
They
whatever.
said more literal than that. They used the word knives.
Yes. Then, so these people, I mean, under the comments, these people who were invited, but that by that person who knew me in person actually, but she doesn't live in Iran. Like those people who were invited to attack me, they started using the worst words, and they started saying, like they also started calling people in my town to kill me, to teach me a lesson. And then I got a lot of DMs, direct messages on Twitter and on Instagram, that they would stab me with a knife on one side. I mean, like with details. That they would cut me or chop me into pieces. That they would find me. And one person on Twitter even went on to say that killing these prostitutes is more essential than killing mullahs. And it's interesting that I reported that tweet, and a lot of my friends reported that tweet, but Twitter said that the tweet doesn't violate their terms, so it's still there. And the person doesn't have a lot of followers, and he's a refugee in Turkey.
But also
So,
to note,
and it
just to
hasn't
interrupt you
stopped.
a second, the independent website where the initial call to harm you is the Independent is a British website, a British news outlet, and so Britain has really strong online safety laws. So this is actually a violation of UK online safety laws to have death threats on a British website. So it's pretty
I
amazing that
mentioned to
that happened too.
Yeah, exactly. I mentioned because the journalist who did that on she posted it later on Twitter too, and she tagged me on Twitter, and that's how I also and a lot of people found my account and started attacking me. So there were also, as I said, there were people who lived in Isfahan and they were a part of the protest, and they confirmed what I said. One person even like posted pictures from previous protests and compared and gave her statistics on how I was right. And she thanked that person. So then I told her that if you really care about the truth, now that you know that I was right, you would edit the caption of the post that you had on Instagram. Because I'm receiving death threats because of that post. And what they told me was that you're receiving death threats because of your political views.
So
As
this
if
is a
that's like
journalist who tried to manipulate public opinion against you, and you
yeah,
say, "Please stop manipulating it untruly, uh, because I'm getting death threats." And the journalist says, "Oh, it's not my fault. It's your fault that you're getting death threats," is what she says. Even
exactly.
though it's her misinterpretation, her misrepresentation of what you said, and maybe I mean her misfocus on what you said, because if people heard what you said in the whole interview, they would say, "Oh, she's really on the side of this. She just had some differences in tactics, and maybe." And well, actually, you could go ahead and comment on what people are now saying about Esfahan and the protest levels, because it seems like the population is now slowly starting to realize that what you said was true, and what
Exactly.
they were wanting to kill you for is now you have people, right? Could you talk about that a little?
Yes, that's the thing. Like, I've talked to a lot of people, and I saw online that a lot of people are posting about how protests in Isfahan were insignificant, and you could see, um, like I said, like people just living their normal lives, and you don't even realize that anything was happening. Like normal life has not been abrupted in Isfahan. And a lot of people were confirming that and saying that, oh yeah, because for example, like Isfahani people, uh, attributing a lot of things to Isfahani people and justifying why there aren't maybe. And some people were also saying that yes, there weren't as many because the state's like repression and crackdown on the protesters has been great, but that's also the case in other cities. It's only that people in different cities react differently to different issues. The issue of mandatory hijab or the morality police is a cultural issue, and it's perceived totally different in different cities. Whereas, for example, the issue of economy is almost, I mean, there are differences, but it's not very different in different cities. And so, like naturally, more people take part into that. And but what you see online is like there is a revolution happening. The establishment is going to collapse anytime, and it's like huge. Everyone in Iran is against it. And one thing that I also wanted to mention is that I saw a lot of images of people burning their scarves, which I understand. They felt this was a symbol of the state, maybe, and they wanted to protest it or the mandatory hijab. But I also have a lot of friends inside Iran and outside Iran who are Muslim, and they felt this was very disturbing. Like they felt insulted because the scarf is also for many people inside Iran. The hijab and the scarf are also not only a symbol of Islam, but also a symbol of fighting imperialism and a lot of values that they held very, I mean, they feel very strong about it. So, and I mean, I think people should be allowed to do it. And that's because I believe in freedom of expression. But at the same time, I think it should not be glorified because I saw even people with hijab from out like Iranian expats who believe in hijab glorifying that act. And I think we have to be very careful because um, that's another thing. Like I was at a gathering, a family gathering a few days ago, where, and there were people from very different ideas. I had family members who wear the chador, the very traditional black hijab, and I had people who don't believe in hijab. There was just like one person who took part in the protest, and was even shot by a rubber bullet, and so like different ideas. And I got my cousins who wear the chador. They were telling me that now they are afraid of coming out because there have been attacks on like people like women with chador or even men who grow beard because some people think
Oh
growing
no.
beard is only for religious people. Yes, I have like, yeah,
Is
I've
this short
heard from
enough?
people.
Would I be safe?
Yes, you look okay. So I don't, I don't think they're going to attack you. Yeah. So, and I think glorifying those acts probably facilitates those attacks on people who have different ideas. And yeah, it. I mean, you can't believe in freedom of expression only for yourself. You have to believe in it for others too.
So would it be safe to say that this what started out as ostensibly civil disobedience morphed into like violent protests, and now has the violent protests have died down, and now it's morphed into like sporadic terrorist attacks? Because I see a key port for trade with China and Russia has been burned, sounds just like other women's rights protests I'm familiar with. And and there's now a war with the Kurds on the side of on the border of Iraq, also very in line with women's rights protests. And I'm being facetious, obviously, and now throughout the country, people who dress religiously, men who have long beards, women who dress conservatively, are now at risk of random terrorist attacks. And to me, that sounds like
Yes.
straight out of Gene Sharp's Regime Change Handbook, where you turn a country into you make a country afraid of internal random acts of violence, and that slowly destabilizes a country's ability to provide a secure environment for its citizens, which leads to further upheaval. So that's concerning. Yeah. Is that accurate, what I said? Would that be a way of describing the transition we've seen in the last week?
Yes, I mean, like I hear that in Tehran, there were peaceful protests today at some universities, because universities just started holding classes in person today, and without any police intervention or anything, there were peaceful protests, but going on. But in Isfahan, it's almost over. But we had yesterday there was a terrorist attack on at well, what's it called, in Sistan, Balochistan, which is a province at a border with Pakistan, and there is a terrorist group called Jaish al-Adl, which literally means the army of justice, but they're also on U.S. terrorist, the list of terrorist organization, and they have previously assassinated and attacked people. And just yesterday, they killed more than 4 IRGC members, and in the clashes that happened, so far more than 20 people have died. Some say like it's even up to 50 people have died in these attacks, and the scenes that come from that city are really disturbing. Like, a lot of public property has also been damaged, and obviously the IRGC has said that they're going to fight back, because these terrorists were attacking a police station there, and at the border with Iraq, IRGC is targeting Kurdish separatists and terrorist groups in Iraq, because they played a significant role in organizing or infiltrating protests and organizing riots and violent attacks. Many of them have been arrested, and the IRGC has said they won't stop until they stop, like, you know, causing chaos and unrest inside Iran. And that's why it makes it very difficult for Iranians who genuinely want to protest. It becomes very difficult for our struggle, because we want to hold peaceful protests, but seeing all those terrorist elements active inside them, because the MEK also has active members. They pay people inside Iran to operate for them, and so it becomes very easy, and for the protest to become violent, and that's why a lot of activists even say that, like, taking it to the streets especially over a long time is not the right solution. I personally believe that people should be allowed and given the permission to protest, and I obviously object. Please crack down on the protesters, and sometimes it gets really violent. A lot of people have already died, uh, which is really sad, because we're just losing more lives. Some of them because of the police, crackdown of the protests, but some of them also died because of the explosives and because of um, what do you say? People who are we probably will never know, or take some time to know who was actually shooting them, because this also happened with the 2009 protests, that people died and you couldn't really say if the police killed them or some just random shooters killed them, because I mean the bullets are probably different, and both sides try to deny that it was because of them. But what happens is that people die, and the country goes down into chaos. And because we have seen what happened to, for example, Syria, and we don't want to see the same thing happen here, because like Syria went into almost a civil war, and a lot of people had to flee the country, and there were a lot of chaos. A lot of the infrastructures were damaged, and at the end of the day, we still, for good or for bad, we still have the Assad's government in place. So that's how, I mean, if if you want to, I mean, for Iran to bring change, we have to just use the legal processes that we have. And I mean, Iranian women know very well, and they're very powerful. We have a very large population of educated women, and we have a very high rate of literacy and university admissions among women. And women are very powerful. They know how to deal with it. And the only thing that if anyone from outside Iran, especially governments, if they really want to support Iranian women, they can start campaigns and ask the U.S. government to lift the sanctions, because they're hurting ordinary Iranian people, especially women. But so far, what has happened is that there have been more sanctions imposed on Iran. So that's how we find it very hypocritical that anyone from outside Iran, like the U.S. government or Canadian government or all these European governments, start talking about women's rights in Iran. It's just so hypocritical. Nobody really believes it. I mean, there are definitely a few people who believe it, but the majority of Iranians know too well that these people, these governments, do not care about our rights at all.
Well, I'd like to touch on a couple two broad topics that you brought up. One you brought up a while back, which I find very interesting, and that's the issue of class, how class factors into this, because I think propaganda on a number of issues, especially in the West, has been targeting a specific class in the last 2 years, and it would be interesting to hear your take on how class has been expressed in maybe 2009, 2019, and now 2022. And the other thing, which I could talk about briefly, is you were talking about the demographics of protests, or I guess we should mention the demographics of protests, because I think in the propaganda in the West, when you say clash or you say protest, people envision like a group of young women like vigorously burning their hijabs or holding their fists up to this. And that may have happened in one or two instances. But the clashes that occurred to kill IRGC members, I would hasten to guess there were no women involved in that. And I would hasten to guess there were no women involved in the border clashes. And I would hasten to guess there's no women involved in burning down port cities. And I would hasten to guess that the majority of almost all street action in all the cities, vast majority, like over 90%, were all men. Am I right in assuming that?
Yes, I mean, with the borders and what happened, for example, these terrorist group, and as I said, it's not considered terrorist group only by Iran, I mean, even with the U.S., they're considered a terrorist organization. Obviously, there are no women. Like even if you see the pictures of the clashes in, for example, Sistan Balochistan, which is a border province, there are no women involved. It's just men, and I mean, they're terrorists attacking a police, trying to attack a police station and an IRGC base, and then, well, obviously, it got very violent. Also, at the border with Iraq, there was attack on a police station and some sort of a military base, and it got very violent. And also, yes, on the streets. And there are also videos where groups of men are, they're chanting the slogan against establishment, but they are using like um, what do you say, very insulting, sexist, like swear words, and it's very difficult to understand. Like, I mean, how, and they're very, very
So
small.
they're not women's rights activists, is what you would say, because they're
Absolutely not. Yes,
well.
yeah, but
Well,
the one thing that I want to, I mean, I made it clear in that interview too. But one thing that I want to make clear is that, I mean, I'm a woman. I live in Iran, and I have a problem with a lot of the laws. And yes, I observe hijab as part of something that I believe, but I have friends who don't, and I have always been totally against the morality police, especially the methods that they use. I mean, detaining a woman for just not wearing the dress code. Um, so, I mean, my take on that is very clear. But the thing is, one thing I think, like, these protests became very popular, or very easy to make them look very popular, because it was around the notion of hijab and women's right, based on what the West considers women's rights, right? Like, it's very easy to, when you say that like the Islamic Republic or the Iranian regime does not allow women to like dress the way they want, that's something that makes probably every Western person very angry. Like, they talk about it as being like something that is totally unacceptable and whatever. But for women inside Iran, there are other issues which are like more important, and they are working on that. For example, more rights for in marriage, or in I don't know, like different issues, because you know that interestingly, we have women have really women's status and rights have improved a lot compared to the Pahlavi um, mm, era. And there are all sort of the statistics, and people can find them online. Um, so like, and a lot of people are happy with the things that they have, but are working towards the things that they want. And these protests do not, for a lot of people, they do not look as the best way to pursue reform. So, like, I mean, it's really sad that whenever I want to talk about something, like, I mean, when I want to talk about how imperialists or foreigners have to stay out of it, I have to emphasize a few times that it does not mean that I agree with morality police. It does not mean that I agree with everything that the Iranian government does. But if you take the legitimacy of the establishment that we have away, like showing it as an Islamist repressive regime, you're taking our agency away, you're taking our opportunities for reform away. It is not helping us. It's just making our struggle a lot more difficult. And that's why I feel like I have to I have to speak out and challenge the narrative that exists online, because like simply it does not match the realities on the ground.
Yeah, and not only that, it makes your relationship as a woman with your state much more. It's more on pins and needles. It's more difficult because if you try and stand up for your rights as a woman, now they view you as a possible like outside in like
Exactly.
a terrorist. So, but I wanted to comment about the cultural issue because me just saying that, oh, it's all men protesting. Uh, Someone from a Western propaganda narrative would retort and they would say, oh, but that's the Iranian culture. The women don't go on the street. The men are protesting on behalf of the women. And the irony is those same people would then disregard the women's cultural opinion. So they wouldn't listen to the women. They would disregard the culture of femininity in Iran. And they would say, well, that that's for us to decide. Like, that's the Western narrative to decide like what's good for women in Iran.
Yes.
But the women in Iran don't protest because it's their culture. And it's like, and I mean, there
That's
was
not
a,
even the case. I mean, it's
well, I was
because
gonna
we
say,
have
like,
like women
protests
are always.
in, I was gonna like add to that this is like the protests, for example. You sent me a photo of women in a cafe who had their hair uncovered, and that was their way of protesting. And that is exactly how civil rights protests, most of the most effective ones
Yeah,
in the U.S. happened too. We had sit-ins, you had like people violating the black people
like Rosa.
violating the rules of sitting on the bus, like Rosa Parks. And if you had 100 women go out shopping without a head covering en masse and forced to be arrested, 100 women, that would be a civil rights protest. Or if just women decided to just stop wearing it and get arrested, and it had enough people doing that, that would make a statement. And that's the way you
Ex-
and that's the kind of like
They,
grassroots.
yeah, and they already made it impossible. Like the same picture that I showed you, like the women who went and had breakfast at a cafe without wearing the scarf, and I also retweeted that as a form of peaceful civil disobedience, which and it's not the first time that this is happening. I lived in Tehran for 5 years, and even in Esfahan, you already could see a lot of in it, and we were seeing more and more people taking part in that. But because of the things that happened, and because of the bogus support for women, Iranian women's rights, these two girls, I mean, like one of them at least, who posted that picture, was just recently arrested. Which this probably would not have happened before if there were no protests, if there were no foreign intervention. Because I mean, I'm not supporting the arrest at all, and I'm really it really made me very very sad, because I felt that was a very good way to protest, and I retweeted that picture and talked about it. And then the next day or a couple of days later, I heard that girl was arrested. And this is really outrageous. But you have to also understand that a country who has been under sanctions for 40 years has witnessed a revolution, 8 years of war, like by Saddam against Iran, terrorist groups involved at the borders in different parts of the city. We have our nuclear scientists assassinated. We have like hacking of different systems, and there's so many things happening. Well, obviously the government takes a defensive stance, and especially if something happens on Twitter. I mean, probably. I mean, if they hadn't posted about this, nobody would have found out about it, and they wouldn't be arrested. But they did, and it was a form of encouraging more peaceful civil disobedience. But by now, it has become very difficult to talk about it online, because people fear that they would be arrested. And I personally blame. I mean, yes, I don't agree with what the government does, but I blame that on the foreign intervention, because they made our struggle more difficult.
Yeah, and I think another part of the propaganda that's important, and first I have to say, when you say nuclear scientists, they aren't involved in developing nuclear weapons. There's a whole field of physics that involves studying nuclear things, which can lead to medicine advancements for cancer research. It leads to peaceful nuclear power. In fact, Iran has an American-made nuclear power plant that I visited when I was there, as a way of showing us that this is just a power plant. It's the same power plant that we have in Atlanta at the Georgia Tech campus. It was made by the same manufacturers. It's a research reactor, and it's very important in doing science, basic science. Anyway, regardless, these basic scientists who were just doing basic science were assassinated. But what I was going to say is, part of the propaganda is also when you omit things, you don't talk about things that are very important to talk about. One of the things that has been totally omitted in this is the counter protests that have occurred, where you've had literally millions of people in the streets. People say millions have been in the protests, but that is a massive overstatement, especially if you say millions of women on the streets in Iran. That has not happened. In my opinion, you correct me if I'm wrong, but when you look at the counter protests, they were enormous, and this was happening all across the country. So I was hoping you could talk about that, because nobody in the West knows that this happened.
Yes, that's true. And even those who like those mainstream media outlets who try to cover those protests. I mean, or online, people were saying, no, these pictures are from archives, or they're old pictures and they're photoshopped and whatever, because it's very difficult to fathom the truth about Iran, the realities about Iran. But I know people who took part in those protests, and they were proudly rejecting the foreign intervention, and they wanted to show support for the Islamic Republic. And I have to tell you that a lot of those people are totally against the morality police. They are demanding investigation into the case of Mahsa Amini's death, and they are demanding transparency. But at the same time, they there are huge crowds everywhere, including in Esfahan and in Tehran, people waving the flag of Iran, the actual flag of Iran, not the fake ones, and so showing support for the establishment, for the Islamic Republic. And yes, they get totally ignored because these people believe in fighting imperialism and infiltration of their culture, in uh, just intervention and everything. And they're not recognized. Their voices are never heard. Like, people don't even care. Like, we support Iranian women who think like us, not the Iranian women who don't think like us. And because there were a lot of women taking part into that in that protest, but they're totally ignored.
And that's creeped into a lot of American peace activists, I think, which is a real shame. The ones that should actually be listening to women, like Code Pink. So I think part of that story also is interesting is how there's been at least one Palestinian, I don't know how active she was with the Palestinian rights movement, who's now claiming that Palestinians should disengage from Iran. And it really reminds me of the Syria propaganda, because I was involved heavily with trying to educate people in America about actually what's happening in Palestine, having lived there for a number of years. And I was shocked at how many Palestinian activists, rich liberals, and usually, and how many Palestinians themselves were totally hijacked by interventionist propaganda narratives in Syria, and it divided activism very harshly. It was very, very difficult to find anyone who would understand the interventionist narratives trying to destabilize Syria. I think because it was so perverse, like the idea that the U.S. was funding Al Qaeda and ISIS in order to excuse its interventionism. It was very difficult for people to understand until Max Blumenthal wrote his book, which is a wonderful expose of that evil, called "The Management of Savagery." And for
Yeah,
those who don't
actually,
know,
a lot of
Iran was one of the most important fighters of the terrorists in Syria, Iraq, ISIS and Al Qaeda,
yeah,
unlike the U.S., which
yeah.
covertly supported them. Russia
They
and Iran
accidentally, right?
accidentally the moderate Al Qaeda. They accidentally aren't. And they trained a whole bunch of them. And they spent, like, I don't know how many billions of, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars training guys, and they only ended up with 8 trained moderate rebels or something. I think that was it's just a massive lie.
Yeah, and I think it's also because like if you told people that Iranians are protesting because of fuel prices or because of the economic issues, a lot of people in the West also relate to that, right? They seem like, okay, we also had this
Oh, that's
problem.
true.
This
Yeah.
is also something that we have experienced. But when you say that people like in Iran are protesting because they are forced to wear a headscarf, then this is something that nobody in the West wants to. They feel so outraged. Oh, men are telling women what to wear. No, not men. No, not men. Like, there are also women who believe that the mandatory job has to be in place, and there are a lot of people who are practicing it willingly. And uh, I mean, but it's very easy to demonize Iran with by saying that like Iran has a mandatory hijab law, but it doesn't demonize Iran as much to say that they have economic problems or their like fuel prices have like provoked protest inside Iran, because that also happens in a lot of other countries. So that's I think one thing that allows them for this exaggerated coverage.
But I think we could wrap up with just some funny comments on the stupid propaganda. The one that stands out to me, obviously, is the one where it's a Turkish TV series where a man is like dancing. I don't even know if this is the actual thing in the series. I've never watched it, but the propaganda is that there's a video of this poor man who promised his daughter that he would dance at her wedding, and then the video is of him kind of doing an awkward dance at a funeral, and then a man grabbing him and comforting him because he's obviously bereaved. And I've seen this propaganda used against Palestinians in Gaza because it was used as if Palestinians were sharing this to say that this is a Palestinian man who's grieving over the tomb of, or the death of his daughter, and then it was used to discredit the Palestinians by pointing out that this is fake propaganda. So it was obviously shared pretending to be a Palestinian as a way of then Israelis saying, look at this fake Gaza propaganda, because there's this whole line of Israeli propaganda which is like fake Gaza's faking everything. So they have pictures of people putting makeup on, and it's like, oh, that's fake blood. So the Israelis are all convinced that all the bad stuff they hear about Gaza is all fake, because there's this strong propaganda line to create this narrative in Israel that like Gaza is just a giant theater for Palestinians pretending to be victims. It's really sick. But anyway, this same clip of this guy, which I guess you could, when we edit this video, you could put it in there and just show the tweet, is used as a way of saying that it's a Iranian man who lost his daughter. Kurdish who lost his daughter in the protest.
Kurdish man.
All right, you can tell about it, and tell like who shared it and who has not taken it down from their timeline. I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that J.K. Rowling, the famous writer of Harry Potter series and other novels, retweeted that from another account. But that account, interestingly, had disabled comments. So like people couldn't, like, you had to retweet it and say, like, quote that and say that this is fake. This is from a TV series that has been like aired many years ago. And well, J.K. Rowling has 14 or more than 14 million followers on Twitter, and a lot of people were mentioning it to her and to the original writer of that tweet, but Twitter has not taken it down. It's really interesting how it's still there, and it's very interesting that I wrote about that on my Instagram, and I got my friends messaging me that they had cried over that video. I mean, even those who lived in Iran were believing it, and like they were crying and saying that, oh, this is so sad and everything. Yeah, I mean, that's how propaganda works. You get people from outside control the narrative of your first-hand experience of living here, and that's what is really dangerous with social media, especially Twitter, because like with just the one click, the thing goes viral before anyone can verify, and by the time everyone has seen it and believed it and cried over it, I mean, it's just kind of too late to mention to people that this was fake, this is not a real video.
Yeah, that's true.
I think to just sum it up, I have to make a few points. Like, there is an overwhelming majority that is against the morality police. There is some of these people believe in hijab and even believe in mandatory hijab, but they think the morality police is useless and is is not helpful and it's oppressive. Some of these people do not believe in mandatory, they practice hijab, but they do not believe in mandatory hijab, and they think the morality police should be abolished. Some of these people do not even believe in hijab, and obviously they find it very oppressive that they have to wear the hijab. And they find the morality police oppressive. And I think in order to understand the Iranian society and to like honestly and sincerely care about Iranian women, we have to hear and acknowledge that all these groups exist within Iran. You cannot be the voice of just one section of the Iranian women's society and claim that you care about these women. And what all these women share is that they are affected by U.S. Coercive, unilateral coercive measures, and that the interventions in foreign leaders flaring the fueling this chaos and unrest is just making the struggle for Iranian women a lot more difficult. It makes it very easy for activists inside Iran to be labeled by the state as influenced by foreign powers or working as foreign agents. And no one from outside has the right to take the credit for what Iranian women are powerfully fighting for. It's Iranian women who decide for their country and for what has to happen to them inside their country, and no one else is allowed to have a say because this is our issue. And it's also very important to see how social media, including Twitter and especially Twitter and mainstream media, are suppressing other voices from Iran and are controlling the narrative and not allowing for anything that challenges their narrative of what is going on in Iran. I think this is that's a huge miscalculation of what is going on in Iran now and what will happen to Iran in the future.
I mean, even slight challenges results in death threats of commentators and analysts such as yourself, which is totally unacceptable. So yeah, it's a really unfortunate situation, and I hope people who've listened to this podcast have learned a counter narrative to the baloney that is spewed by the mainstream media. So thanks for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. And if you have any questions about Iran or the situation, please leave them in the comments below, and we'll be happy to take them up. We're probably going to do another episode on this issue within the next week or so. So if you have any questions, we would love to hear them. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.